Hey guys, today's story is about a that guy rogue. Hello, I recently found this subreddit and the Crit Crab channel, and I thought I would share one of my horror stories with you. First off, a little bit of background. This story is very close to 7 years old now, so I apologize in advance if I don't remember all the details. Secondly, I wasn't an experienced roleplayer at the time, so I wasn't aware of all the various nuances that came with TTRPGs. And thirdly, I'm an artist, and I designed a large map to be played on. The setting was in a world called Jinvaras, and the world was designed by myself. All the major countries and the politics were my creation. In many RPG settings, that would mean that I would be the DM, but in this case, the DM was a good friend of mine, and asked if I could help him with the world building. I was more than happy with that, and he wanted to use the campaign to test out a few concepts. I wasn't the DM, as this was my third ever TTRPG, and I wouldn't have been able to DM. For the game system, we decided to use 3.5, as it was the one that the DM and most of us were familiar with at the time. And instead of using a pre-built module and story, the DM suggested to try and push the system to its logical extreme and to test the limits of how far it can go. His preferred DM style is to instead create a wide open world with not a single storyline as with most RPG stories, but instead focus on the individual characters and how their decisions affect the world and characters around them. In other words, this RPG would be focusing heavily on character arcs. We were doing a pirate-themed campaign, and I helped to design the various characters and lore, and I drew a large map to follow along and track where the group had sailed and such. The characters also nominally had character alignments, but that didn't really come into play. Keep in mind as well that I had to travel about an hour to get down to where the group was playing the game, so that was a little bit more hassle for me. The cast of characters were the DM, who was a good friend of mine and an experienced player and DM, myself, playing a cleric and the ship's cook, the Face, a friend and the host of the apartment we were gaming in, the de facto party leader, and also an experienced player and DM, the Fighter, which was one of the DM's longtime friends, also an experienced player, the Necromancer, the DM's girlfriend, the Rogue, Face's friend, not anymore, and the main person causing all the drama, the Drunken Dwarf, who was my friend who played a dwarven drunken master, and then the new player, who was a later addition invited by the Rogue. And as stated before, this campaign was designed to push 3.5 to the limits. We created some very creative characters with some crazy gimmicks, and the stats reflected that. For instance, Face played a Fey Psionic, who could mind link with several people at once. The Fighter, who was half dragon and half giant, carried around a giant sword and could do ridiculous amounts of damage with a single swing, kind of like Guts from Berserk, and so on. Instead of starting at a lower level and going slowly up, we all started at level 12 and had the corresponding boosts and starting gold. So far, this seemed pretty interesting, right? So, what does the rogue build? A human rogue, that's it, full stop. No extra race modifiers or boosts. There were various layers to the story since many of us in this group were also part of a school club and were mostly part of the same social group. But now with all that out of the way, let's begin. I originally wanted to be more of a background character and watch the Face and the Fighter roleplay as they were much more experienced, while I tried doing more combat and healing stuff. The first several sessions went very well, and we explored the world and did some amazing fights. And the Face and Fighter really showed what it was like to truly roleplay characters, and make decisions and see how the various dice were rolled. Face, for example, was able to negotiate purchasing a large galleon for almost half price using the Rogue's help, using persuasion and clever sleight of hand. Now, the Rogue story is the one that we'll be focusing on. His backstory was that he was a big-shot pirate in the seas, and was originally from a noble family. However, a no-name pirate called Shackles caused him to lose his status, and slandered his character's father, and caused him to become exiled. Again, it sounded like a revenge story mixed with some trying to reclaim their lost title, and as we started following his story, we would do various story rolls while we were sailing to various locations. The characters would roll a d6, and the higher the number, the better the outcome. When it was the rogue's turn, he rolled a 6. And keep in mind that we had done several of these story rolls already, and this was the 5th or 6th time. And each time, he rolled a 6. The DM told him that he found a medallion signifying his noble line, and we finished a battle, and the session ended. In the next session, we were told that Face had to travel out of state for family business, so we had to make arrangements and tweak the focus. And before Face left, the party was able to acquire enough money to buy a small island and establish not just a hideout or base, but an entirely new settlement. This new port city would be a safe haven for oppressed species and such, and wouldn't have any ties to any of the major countries. The main draw of the city? A glorious new arena that would have a built-in maze, and gladiatorial matches, with the fighter as the ringer. So in story, Face was now busy overseeing the construction of this new city, and this meant that we had to now pick a new party leader, and the party voted on the rogue. We had Necromancer, and we thought that she would be a decent candidate, but she explicitly told us that that would be a bad idea. And this is when things started to go south. As we were prepping for the next session, I asked Rogue if I could purchase an item to increase my spell slots, and his response was,
"Oh, so you want an item so you can cast more useless spells?"
I was a little offended by this, but after some wrangling, the DM persuaded Rogue, and as we were going into a large battle, the Rogue seemed to be getting very good rolls, and doing a lot of damage. However, due to the way he led the battle, we wanted to vote him out and almost mutinied on him. About a month later, Face returned, and we filled him in on what was happening during his absence. We scheduled a time where all of us could meet together, and all of us showed up, and the rogue showed up with someone else. He wanted to bring him into the campaign, and all of us were wary, as we were all pretty far into the story and campaign at this point. At first, I didn't want to rock the boat, but we were pushing 8 people in the party, so things were getting pretty chaotic, just by the sheer number of people. The party had captured Shackles, and the rogue wanted to kill him. So Face stepped in and suggested that, since the maze/gauntlet portion of the arena was completed, why not use this as an opportunity to try to test it and run it? It was more sporting, and we all got to have some entertainment. The rogue, knowing that he was outmatched, used his high intimidate and forced all of us to give him our magical items so that he would have a much higher shot at winning and surviving. The newest player practically gave the rogue all of his items without doing a check, citing a rather dubious reason that the rogue had saved his life at one point, and it was time to start the gauntlet. The start went alright. Shackles got ahead and the rogue had a much harder time keeping up, because Shackles had several inherent boosts from his race, while Rogue, even with all the buffs, was still a human rogue. And each time the rogue would roll, he would say the number of the roll, and then the DM would do the calculations to see if he succeeded or failed. But before he would do that, the rogue would call out,
"Wait, I have X item that gives me a bonus."
And as such, he would barely be able to make it. And as the gauntlet progressed, it became increasingly apparent that something was off. With the way that the rogue was built, I had a gut feeling that there was no way he would be able to keep making all of those saves, and yet, the dice kept rolling in the rogue's favor. And when they both finally got to the end of the gauntlet, they had a duel, and by some miracle, Shackles was defeated, and the rogue survived, but not without a very huge cost. At the very end of the gauntlet, there was a statue that fired some kind of magical beam, and the rogue somehow triggered it and got zapped, and he got teleported back to the beginning of the maze, but now completely stripped of all of his armor, and all those magical items he forced the rest of the party to give to him were now gone. Needless to say, none of us in the party were happy. Since this was a completely open-ended story, there wasn't some great big battle or boss the DM had set up, nor some epic conclusion that would have wrapped everything up. By this point, many of us were getting tired, as we had played this campaign for almost a year and a half, and playing every other week or so. We all thought and agreed to do one last session, and one last battle before the ending of the campaign. As we were about to start the last session, the rogue and the new player went to a different room to discuss something. I wasn't sure what was going on, but it seemed a little suspicious. And as we started, the rogue and the new player tried to do some weird bullcrap trick and tried to overthrow Face and launch a coup. The NPC crew, which ran and operated the ship, was close to being between 300 and 400, and I think the rogue was betting that a good chunk of them would be loyal to him. Now, being pirates, mutinies and such would have made an interesting and not uncommon event. Except for the fact that the rogue and the new player had decided to pull that without consulting any of us, including the DM, so all of us had to scramble to deal with the inter-party conflict and take time away from us focusing on the last fight. And this wasn't the first time that something like this had happened with the rogue. Being the troll that he is, he loved to instigate conflict for the sake of conflict. He would take opposing sides of arguments, simply for the sake of argument. I'm not against inter-party conflict and some drama, and in some cases, it creates good storytelling, and having everyone agree would be too unrealistic. But it's when that drama starts to become detrimental, and doesn't move the characters or story forward, that it really gets on everyone's nerves. We also got pretty angry, as we see that he brought along the new player, simply to be a yes man to him, and to him alone. We were all able to talk him down, but it left a pretty bad taste in everyone's mouth. The damage was done, and we finished that last fight, and while it was spectacular, towards the end while we were trying to fight a particular boss, the rogue broke ranks, and tried to flee the battle. He managed to get one of the NPCs to come with him, and tried to take a small boat, to not just flee the battle, but to desert the party altogether. Luckily, the fighter found out about this and proceeded to shoot and sink the small ship, thus ending the rogue's life by having him drown. So that's the end of the story, right? No. The fallout from this campaign, and the ensuing drama that it caused, is what truly turned into a horror story. Remember how his character was a human rogue, and he kept rolling a high number almost every single time? And when he rolled damage, he did really well. The DM in Face felt something was off with how he rolled, as he would roll the dice, call the number, and then pick up the dice before the DM could see it. We also noticed that when he rolled damage, he would always roll a specific set of dice. So the DM in Face both asked to see his dice, and they threw a couple of random ones in a bowl of water, and with several of the dice, one side would come up more often than the others. In other words, he had weighted dice. And this is when things started to get really ugly. When the group found out about this, and confronted him about it, he got really defensive and kept complaining that he had done nothing wrong, and that he couldn't be held responsible for his own actions. I was dumbfounded and angry the whole time. And the whole time, for over a year, the only reason why he was able to get away with this was because it wasn't something any of us were able to catch or prove until after the campaign ended. And this is where the various layers started to crack on top of each other. As stated before, some of the group went to the same college, including the rogue, DM, and Face. We also hung out in the same social groups, so this campaign didn't take place in a vacuum. Throughout the campaign, the rogue would go out of his way to belittle all of us, both in and out of character. For instance, since I did the drawings and such, he would go out of his way to insult them, while I tried to put genuine effort into the campaign. And keep in mind that this was my world and setting, not the DM's. But it didn't just stop at me. He went out of his way to degrade everyone, even though all of us put genuine effort into our characters, while he seemed to put the bare minimum into his character. The rogue even went as far as to compare one of the other players to a glorified healing knife. He had an overinflated ego and self-worth, and constantly thought that he was the smartest guy in the group, and he looked down upon anyone who didn't agree with him. And it's not like we didn't try talking or working with him. The rogue was a jerk, but we tried to get him to move past that. His response,
Well, that's just how my character is.
I remember very distinctly. All of us were silent when he said that. I want to take a step back from the story at this point, and point out that RPGs have storytelling, characters, and character growth. And throughout any relatively long campaign, characters are supposed to develop, grow, and change over time. But throughout that entire time, the rogue's character stayed exactly the same, and never moved past the selfish part. I don't know if it was because he was too lazy to do character growth, or simply because he wanted to roleplay a jerk so he could act like that towards the rest of the group. The rogue and the DM didn't see eye to eye to begin with, but with the conflict that came up during the campaign, and the conflict that came up between them outside of the campaign during club activities, tensions finally reached a breaking point, and the rogue took the confrontation between him and the DM, and decided to try to get the DM kicked from the college, and tried bullying everyone else out of Face's house in an effort to remain as part of the group. Luckily, Face and everyone else in the group had enough of his antics, not just with his overall behavior, which we had pulled him aside and talked to him privately about. And when the threats became too much, he was banned not just from TTRPGs, but our group and Face's place altogether. The campaign pushed our relationship with him to the breaking point. That whole incident caused me to step away from the group for over a year and a half, and put me off of doing TTRPGs for over 2 years. What was supposed to have been a nice social game for all of us to goof off and have fun in, turned out to be a nightmare for me that dragged many of my friends into in-real-life drama, and nearly got the DM expelled from school, and nearly got the rogue slammed against a wall. I look back on this and still feel somewhat traumatized by it. But as I've become more experienced, I've learned how to vet players and stay away from that guys. But in any case, guys, that's the end of the story. If you liked it and would like to listen to more, make sure you subscribe and stay tuned for future videos. But, as always, have a good one.